Welcome to another episode of the Mideast News Hour. I'm recording this week from the United States, where we are for a lecture tour and some family visits. At any rate, a lot of news. Israel had a 3-day campaign in Gaza against only Islamic Jihad. President Trump's home in Mar-a-Lago was raided on Sunday by the FBI. Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan, and Taiwan began ratcheting up its actions, its offensive operations against Taiwan in a way we haven't seen in the past, and on and on and on. A lot of things to talk about this week. And the person that I wanted to talk about all of this with, take a deep dive into the strategic nature of our times, or the major strategic challenges that we're facing, and how our leaders in the United States, in Israel, and in other parts of the world are dealing with them, not to mention, of course, the huge thing, which is Iran. The United States is back in Vienna negotiating yet again with the Iranians, and according to news reports, they're about to sign a deal. How surprising. It's come to an end game again with Iran. Is Michael Doran from the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. Michael is a former senior member of the National Security Council under George W. Bush. He's written copiously on the Middle East, on Turkey, on other areas of Central Asia, and he's a really smart guy. And I wanted to spend this week taking advantage of the fact that we're on the same side of the pond and talk about these big issues with Michael Doran. So thanks so much, Michael, for joining me today on the program. You can
great to be here.
Great to see you. So I just want to start with just sort of a general question. When we look at Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan, when the United States doesn't seem to have any significant military option for actually dealing with Taiwan today, China is far more powerful today than it was when the United States began talking about protecting Taiwan after they opened relations with China in the 1970s. And when you look at what's happening with the Iran policy, that the United States, as Iran's Palestinian proxy, Islamic Jihad, with the assistance of Iran's other Palestinian proxy, Hamas, is pummeling Israel cities with 1,000 projectiles in 3 days. The United States is in Vienna trying to figure out a way to give sanctions relief, which will spell out to $1 trillion or so, to the very same Ayatollahs that are funding and sponsoring and organizing all of the rebellions that are going on, or not rebellions, wars that are going on in the Middle East and beyond. There was even an American Iranian dissident in Brooklyn who was almost murdered last week when an Iranian regime agent armed with an AK-47 was caught and arrested on her balcony. So we have all of this going on, and here's the United States plowing forward. So the main question, or the sort of conceptual question that I want to begin our discussion with is, are these people stupid? I mean, is it stupidity? How do you best describe, what is your best sort of meta explanation of the behavior of the likes of Joe Biden and his advisors? Is it stupidity? They fundamentally not understand the consequences of their actions and of what's happening in the Middle East, or is there something else? And if it's stupidity, how did we get to this? We're going to stop fighting this Zoom conference that seems to always want to go to you when I'm in the middle of a sentence. So we're just going to move to this gallery view, and that's that. We're going to stay here. But how are we to understand what is a sort of larger meta explanation, do you think, of American behavior? And is stupidity playing a role here?
Not stupidity as commonly understood. I mean, I think the people running America are highly intelligent people, and they have at their disposal unbelievable amounts of information and analyses and so forth. But I think they're ideologically blinkered. So, you know, if you want to use the word stupidity, it's the kind of stupidity that takes a PhD, because they have been trained to see the world in a certain way, and they are, despite all the cognitive dissonance, they're holding on to the basic fundamental worldview that was established, a decade or two ago. Does that
make them fanatics? Because I think that you could say that a definition of fanaticism is that you hold on to a belief system, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that it's incorrect?
I don't think they're fanatics either. I do think they are in an ideological war inside the United States. I mean, we are highly polarized, and the elite, especially the Democratic elite, but it's not only the Democrats. There's an elite class of people working in national security, and they do see the populism in the country as their enemy, but especially the progressive Democrats. I mean, you can see their commitment, for example, to climate change and to the policies that are supposedly designed to alleviate climate change. It's very easy to show that those are not going to work. It's very easy to show that they're not working right now. And yet I see no sign whatsoever that there's an effort on their part to reconsider. It wasn't that long ago that Fareed Zakaria, who's not hostile to them by any stretch of the imagination, wrote an article in the Washington Post saying, "Hey guys, let's consider natural gas, because it's a great transition. It's a great transition fuel in order to get to where you want to go without destroying the economy." That was a rational effort to contend with the challenges of the day. As far as I can tell, it got no play.
Well, it got no play. He's lucky that he wasn't crucified. I mean, a lot of times when anybody raises even the smallest amount of doubt about whether they should go forward with zero fossil fuel emissions within the next 15 minutes, they get canceled.
Right. Well, maybe that's why he's not pushing it much anymore, because he can see the writing on the wall. But that's the kind of thing. I think that that what you're seeing in the energy area, you're seeing in national security, and you're seeing in domestic politics as well.
And what's the ideological framework how would you describe the ideological framework that they're operating within? I mean, that you have to destroy your energy sector, you have to betray your allies and appease your enemies. You have to gut your military, and we can talk a little bit about what they're doing to the U.S. military right now in the face of rising threats to your own nation. And we could just go on and on. What do you think the ideology driving them is?
Well, I think the key is the balance of power in domestic American politics. That's the prize. The big prize is blue America versus red America. If I take it back to energy, oil and gas are the bread and butter of red America, less of a blue America. And so gutting the fossil fuel industry in the United States is not going to harm blue America as much as it's going to harm red America in the elections. I mean, that's, by the way, that's a very crude analysis. Ultimately, there's an intellectual dimension to this. It's not simply a pragmatic political agenda, but to the extent that it's a pragmatic political agenda, that's what they're working from.
Let me just make it a little bit more difficult for you, because I can see pragmatic political agendas being served by many things that don't involve destroying the American economy, that don't involve gutting American manufacturing, that don't involve midnight raids on political opponents' homes, arresting people at pre-dawn when they're 72 years old and don't pose a threat to anybody. That's on the one hand. I mean, there are a whole host of things that you could fight about politically and not cause grievous harm to your political system or to your way of life. And that's not the moves that the Democrats are making.
That's because the most dynamic element in the Democratic coalition is the progressives, and the progressives have a set of commitments to certain issues, climate being the first and foremost. And climate is attractive to Democrats writ large, because if there's a climate emergency, that gives them the right to take control of all aspects of the economy and to do with them whatever they want in the name of mitigating climate disaster. They're working to establish climate commissars in every bureaucracy who will be able to review almost every policy as to whether it's going to benefit the climate or harm it. It's a way of taking control without admitting it. And so,
but what you're discussing, I mean, the kind of control that you're talking about isn't just winning an election and holding power. The kind of control that you're talking about is total control.
Yeah, well, that's the dream. That's certainly their dream. That's the Democrats writ large can see that this ideology gives them control, and so a control that is not subject to oversight by the electorate. It's not. It supersedes.
This is a fundamentally not.
It supersedes traditional checks and balances.
Right. It's fundamentally non-democratic, anti-democratic, even organizing, not organizing principle, but goal. I mean,
yeah, I think so. But it's all in the name of saving the entire world. So particularly and saving supposedly saving the weakest among us first. Of course, that's not true, but that's what the ideology says.
Well, the Sri Lankans would beg to differ with that, right? I mean,
we're doing it in their name. We're doing it in the name of the Sri Lankans and the Bangladeshis and.
Okay, so why don't we just move on from the totalitarian impulse of the Democrats in the United States? Although I think that this is perhaps a story of our time. I mean, that you have a now ruling party in the United States that's seeking total power, and how did that happen, and what's happening in the largest and most important democracy in the world, or oldest and most important and powerful democracy in the world, that may be really the animating principle behind everything that's happening internationally today. But I think that we have to talk a little bit about what's happening, or a lot about what's happening internationally. And maybe we should start with, what should we start with? Do you think that we should start with what just happened in Gaza? Or I don't actually think, and I just wrote an article to the effect that you can't actually separate what happened in Gaza over the weekend from what's going on with Iran and the United States, and we have Iran that, by all accounts, really has crossed the nuclear threshold and is now capable of producing nuclear weapons basically whenever they decide, if they haven't decided already to do so, in terms of the quantity of enriched uranium that they have stockpiled. You have an Iran that is attacking.
Can I stop you there?
I'll be happy if you do.
I want to quibble with you about one thing.
Okay. It's
something that I wrestle with myself. I think it's important that those of us who oppose the Iranian nuclear aspirations, don't present their acquisition of a bomb as a fait accompli. They want to do that. I think that there's really, as far as we know, there's some significant distance they have to go. Yes, certainly correct that in terms of having fissile material, they're within enough for a bomb. They're within weeks, not months of having that. But they still have to put it on a warhead, and they still have to put the warhead on a missile, and so on and so forth. So there's a significant distance to go yet. And I don't want to present it as if we've already lost. I'm not optimistic that we're going to win, but I think we still have to fight the fight, and we should.
Well, I think we have to fight the fight as well. And what I'm saying is not preaching demoralization. Rather, I mean, I think that we had set goals for ourselves, and we've already failed to reach them. Right? I mean, yep. One of the goals of the Iranian nuclear deal from 2015 was specifically to block them from ostensibly, specifically to block them from stockpiling the quantities of enriched uranium that they have stockpiled, but specifically to prevent them from, induce them not to enrich uranium to higher levels. But on the other hand, while it was specifically geared towards preventing them from doing all of these things that they've done, it also permitted them to develop advanced centrifuges, which they developed and brought into line in 2021, that have enabled them to enrich uranium
I, of
to the
course,
levels that they
yeah,
have.
sure. I of course agree with all that. I told you it was a quibble. Just I want to make sure that we don't
No, I think that
get
it's
ahead of
important to
ourselves.
be precise. I'm not sure I agree with you because maybe you have more information than I do, but I have no way of knowing how long it's going to take them to develop the capabilities if they haven't already to do all of the things.
I have I have no information that you don't have. I
At
just
any
think
rate,
but
they're
I have no
very
reason to
advanced.
believe that they have this.
So they're very advanced. Let's just put it that way. They're very advanced in their nuclear capabilities, far more than they were when Joe Biden came into office in January 2021, far more than they were even when Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz and Naftali Bennett came into office, when they came into office in May, June 2021. So the question is, first of all, what would under these circumstances, what do you think that a constructive policy to prevent Iran from becoming a declared or actual nuclear armed state would look like?
Well, there's only one conceivable policy now, and that's what Donald Trump called maximum pressure, and that means maximum economic pressure combined with covert action and military deterrence, credible military deterrence. And right now we don't have any of that. We have just the opposite. We should, by the way, we've already blown past Gaza. We should talk about Gaza.
Oh no, I want to go back to Gaza. Don't get me wrong. I want to go back to Gaza, but I wanted to start with the source. I wanted to start with Iran and then move to Gaza, because I don't think that Gaza makes sense if you can't see it in the context of Iran. So
yeah, it doesn't. I totally agree. Unfortunately, the Israeli government missed an opportunity here to connect the two.
So how do you mean?
Well, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Iranians, and my understanding, you may have a different understanding. My understanding of what happened is that the Palestinian Islamic Jihad was moving into the West Bank, undoubtedly with the encouragement of the Iranians, in order for the Iranians to develop, following the model that they're using all over the Middle East of building up proxies and arming them with precision guided weaponry and other tools to put pressure on the Israelis, further pressure on the Israelis. The Israelis started rolling them up in the West Bank, and that then led the PIDGE to shoot rockets out of Gaza in an effort to connect the West Bank and Gaza politically, and the Israelis then carried out strikes to degrade Palestinian Islamic Jihad successfully. I mean, by all accounts, this was a successful Israeli operation. I think all the congratulations that the Israelis are giving themselves for having kept Hamas out of the fight, for having degraded Palestinian Islamic Jihad, for having protected their own population and so on, is well deserved. But there was I think the connection to Iran needed to be made clearer. And I think the connection between Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Iran needed to be made clearer. And more importantly, the connection to the Iranian nuclear program and to the negotiations that are going on in Vienna. You read the Israeli press, looking for some kind of connection, because we're talking about going back to the nuclear deal in Vienna again now, and the Israeli government is silent about that at the very moment when it's battling an Iranian proxy.
So, just so you guys know, I just wrote an entire article about this. It'll be coming out in JNS this week. But but I'd like to get your take on it. If you were advising the caretaker government over the weekend. I mean, how would you advise them to make the connection real? I mean, obviously, the head of Islamic Jihad was in Iran the entire time, over the entire past week.
That
But
helps.
you know what? You say that, and then people say, "Well, so what? Then that, then so what? I mean, what does it matter? How could he have been directing all of this from Iran when it was happening in Gaza? What is the tangible connection between him being in Iran? Does that mean that Iran is calling it in? That they're telling the Palestinians, "Oh, shoot at Tel Aviv now, shoot at Yavne now"? Or what?
I don't
How
know
is
that I don't know I don't know to the extent to which the Iranians are actually picking the targets. But there's no doubt that the Palestinian Islamic Jihad works for Iran. That's not, there's no doubt about that. It's funded by Iran. It gets its training from Iran. Its leadership, as you mentioned, was in Iran at that moment. So, but I think the larger thing here is that the Lapid government is in an alliance with the Biden team against Trump and Netanyahu. And part of that means that they have to, one, denigrate maximum pressure, which is the only policy that can actually achieve what we all want to achieve. They have to denigrate it publicly, and they have to claim time and again that their policy of not criticizing the Lapid government has to, and it was Bennett before this, Bennett and Lapid, and now Lapid. They have to claim all the time that they're getting greater achievements with the United States by not criticizing the American policy toward Iran. They do this explicitly. At the same time, when they don't hide the fact that they don't like the JCPOA, they don't hide the fact that they don't think the JCPOA is going to achieve what it says it's going to achieve. But they claim that this method of handling the Americans, which is to work with them, to not criticize them, and so forth, is going to achieve much greater goals, and not, in fact, and much greater results for Israel, and in fact is gaining greater results for Israel. And that's just nonsense. And what it ends up doing is it gives us a stamp of kashrut to the American policy of appeasing Iran. And they have a whole set of arguments as to why this isn't the case, but we don't need to go through all of them, but it's totally bogus. The fact of the matter is that the biggest problem that Israel has today is not Iran, it's the American appeasement of Iran. And they have to see that, but they cannot define that as the problem. Even in their own minds, they can't define that as the problem because they need Biden to fight Netanyahu.
I mean, I think it goes back to my initial question about whether these people are stupid or not. And I think that, your answer is very important. And maybe we should just go back for another couple minutes. It's like, we'll go out into the real world, and then we'll go into the little political cocoon that all of the leadership is in, because they're two separate things. So let's go back to the leadership cocoon for a second. So what we're seeing here in Israel and in the United States is that you have these leaderships that are much more that are completely actually focused on their own power and seizing power, maintaining power, keeping the other guy as far from power as possible. And we saw it again in Mar-a-Lago. We see it with the legal fraternity. We've had more and more things coming out, information coming out from inside sources inside of the Attorney General's office, the State Prosecution's office, about the levels of corruption inside of the state prosecution that was completely obsessed with only one thing, subordinated every single other thing to that, which is ousting Netanyahu from power over the past 4 years, and continues it still today. And so you see that, and I'm going to have a show about this specifically also next week, but you see that on the one hand, the world is raging outside your door, and your economies are going under because of a lot of the policies that you're putting forward, but all you care about is power and maintaining it and keeping the other guy out.
Yeah, I think that's I think that's what's going on. Or let's just say that is a key element. I would like to as a foreign policy specialist at a think tank dedicated to policy, not politics, I would like to be able to talk about this without mentioning politics. It wasn't that long ago in the United States that you could actually do that. But I don't think I can do my job to the fullest extent if I don't bring politics into it, because I think politics is shading politics and sort of political paradigms are influencing everything that's happening in foreign policy.
You know, it really brings me back to 30 years ago almost, which is when I was in the army and I was in the talks in Oslo. And we would get, not in Oslo, the Oslo Peace Accords when I was in the army, and we would get the daily intelligence briefings, and they would tell us everything that was happening in the Arab world. But I always felt that the one thing that was missing from that, which was the most important thing, which was what was happening in Israel. That at a certain point, when your politics become radicalized, and you're not willing to deal with what's happening outside of your borders because of what's happening inside of your borders in the power struggle, then you actually become the story. You can't understand the world around you without first focusing on what you're doing to impact it. And I think that the same really holds today in the United States, where you have such a radicalized ruling class, and in Israel, where we do. At the end of the day, everything around us is revolving. They are much more objectified in our eyes, because we're the ones that are sort of, we're the ones that are, in Hebrew you say mechololim et andramusia, we're the ones that are causing the chaos even more than they are, because we're making it difficult for ourselves to be able to rationally analyze reality. And if you can't understand that, if you can't understand the madness that's sort of taking hold of the people that are supposed to be in charge, then you can't understand. But I do want to go to the question of stupidity one more time, because I want to just leave the Middle East for a second and go to Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, because I think that also is an even more, from an American perspective at least, it's an even more fundamental move. I mean, what is America's plan for defending Taiwan? I mean, it brings it into question, because she provoked the Chinese to take offensive action of one sort or another against Taiwan. And then you ask, well, what was standing behind her? Was there a plan to protect Taiwan? Has the Biden administration readied itself? And she was sent there to begin a confrontation with China, because that would be perhaps rational. If the United States has come to the conclusion that they want to confront China, that this is the moment that the United States has chosen, then sending the Speaker of the House of Representatives to Taipei makes sense. Otherwise, why would she go?
Yeah, I think it's a blunder. I think that something happened. There's been a revolution in American foreign policy in the last 5-7 years. I don't know exactly when it was. And the revolution is this. Up until then, whenever this change took place, maybe it's not a revolution yet, but there's been a change in the balance of power in the world. Up until recently, that's from the end of the Cold War until recently, the Americans understood that they could be the dominant element in any war anywhere in the world if they chose to be. Not just the dominant, but the prevailing element. If they chose to be. Now, I mean, there are certain fights that are not worth fighting, or the cost of fighting them would be too great. But there was this notion that anywhere we chose to put ourselves, we could project power into any arena and ultimately prevail. That is no longer the case. That is no longer the case. And Taiwan is the place where that changed. If we were to go to war, God forbid, with the Chinese tomorrow over Taiwan, it's not at all guaranteed that we win that war. Now, I don't think that's going to happen. I hope it doesn't happen, and it would be an extremely ugly war for everyone. But that's a change in international politics. The United States is simply objectively not as powerful as it used to be. It's also getting weaker in the Middle East, much, much weaker in the Middle East. It's still the dominant power by far in the Middle East, but its power is being eroded significantly, and everyone who's watching that closely can see that. So I don't think although our national security, the top experts, the top officials in national security know these facts, I don't think that their general worldview has adjusted significantly. I think it started to adjust a little bit over Ukraine, but Putin's own miscalculations in Ukraine were so great, so significant, that the full impact of the American miscalculations didn't have were not felt in Washington in the end. I mean, the pullout from Afghanistan, again, it was humiliating, but the full significance of that, I don't think permeated the consciousness. So we've got this attitude on the part of the ruling elite in the United States that we are unassailable, and it's starting to erode that understanding, but it has not fully adjusted. It's a kind of a paradigm that's under threat. And I think it's going to take, unfortunately, some very, very rude shocks. I hope they're not so rude as to result in permanent erosion of American power or a great loss of life. But there are going to be some more rude shocks before we become aware that we cannot just simply do whatever we want without taking into consideration the reactions of other powers around the globe.
You know, that brings me to another question. My friend and colleague David Goldman has been on the show a few times, and he made the point about China in another context, where he said one of the differences between the United States and China is that China never has had an ally. They don't know what an ally is. They gobble people up. They have client states, but they don't have states that operate with them, in alliance. That's not their way, as opposed to the American way, which is to have alliances and to actually have allies and to see them as such, to see them as partners, whether it's Britain, whether it's anyone, France, Israel from time to time under the Trump administration in particular, but NATO, ASEAN. The United States operates under the format of alliances, and it has allies. And when we look at what the Americans are doing now in the Middle East, in appeasing Iran at the expense of its allies, when we see what it's doing in Ukraine, which I don't know, does it strengthen NATO when they don't have a policy for getting Russia out, or does it undermine NATO? I mean, you can look at it all sorts of ways, but the United States, certainly in the Middle East, and we see now with Colombia's new foreign minister going to Iran yesterday, I think we're taping the show on Monday. We're seeing that the United States is losing allies in South America, losing allies in the Middle East, or undermining their alliances in the Middle East. Can the United States operate without allies?
I don't want to contradict you directly.
Contradict me away.
And rudely. Yeah, today's Tuesday.
Oh, I'm sorry. I knew it was something wrong with what I was saying. Well, there you go. We're taping it too early in the morning.
I was going to say it earlier because you had the FBI rating Trump. You had the FBI rating Trump on Sunday as well. So yeah, you lost a day somewhere in your travels.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm
anyway.
sorry, guys. I hope that the rest of my analysis is better than my knowledge of the days of the week.
No, it's I'm with you there. It's true. We have an advantage over the Chinese, exactly as you say, in that we have the capacity. We don't always exercise it, but we have the capacity to cultivate alliances, and people want to ally with us, and we have working with us. To balance the Chinese, we have the South Koreans and the Japanese and the Australians and even the Indians. I don't know if you want to call them an ally, but certainly we can work with them to achieve those goals. And that's one of the great, that's going to be the thing I think that's going to save the United States if we wake up. But something has happened under the progressives, and that is that, and this is not simply the Democrats. I mean, there's a kind of Republican arm of the progressive movement, and that is that we are insisting on ideological conformity of our allies. That was not the strategy that won the Cold War. If you go back to Truman, the early days of the Cold War, they sat and they looked at who the Soviet Union was and who the United States was. And they said the difference between the Soviet Union and the United States is the Soviet Union is trying to create a single unified system with everybody ideologically on exactly the same page. That's not us. Our attitude is, you can be whoever you are as long as you work with us against our enemies. You can have your own internal system and your own idiosyncrasies, and so forth. I want us to go back to that. That's what I want us to go back to, and I want us to look at, just have a national interest approach where we say China, Russia, Iran. That's the problem. Let's take it apart. Let's look around the globe at who's willing to help us in different ways with that problem, and let's ally with them, and let's not insist that they agree with every ideological statement that we come up with this week.
Can I challenge you now?
Sure.
Okay.
You're not gonna, as long as you're not gonna challenge me on the day of the week.
Well, you seem to have a better grasp of that than I do, so I'm not going to challenge you on that.
Okay.
But I think I've argued, and I think it's a reasonable argument that this actually began. I mean, if you want to, it's gone on for a long time. You could start with Wilson, with making the world safe for democracy. But I think that we saw this kind of, let's get involved with the internal politics of our allies and or our enemies or whatever, with the Bush administration, with the whole democracy push. And you could even begin it with
you're not going to, we're not going to have an argument. We're not going to have an argument.
All right, but let's just talk about that, because I think that this is a bipartisan thing. Then it's not just the progressives. When Condoleezza Rice empowered the Muslim Brotherhood in the 2005 elections for the Egyptian parliament, because she insisted on free elections in Egypt, that was a problem. I mean, not to mention everything that happened in Iraq, which is that you had Iran coming in and massively funding all of its proxies in Iraq, and the United States saying, well, we're not going to get involved with funding people because that would be anti-democratic. So that the Americans gave all of the options to its enemies to get involved and subvert all of the democratic forces in Iraq, but it wouldn't help the ones that were with it. It never helped its friends, and it allowed its enemies to help its enemies, which was a major factor in the American defeat there. So, not only did you see the United States pushing democracy.
Unfortunately, I'd love to have a fight with you, but unfortunately, this is not going to be it, because
you agree with me?
I do, yeah. It's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable for me. It's uncomfortable for me to agree with you, because I worked in the Bush administration, and I entertained a lot of those notions at the time. I was never a zealous proponent of the democracy promotion agenda. I've always been more focused on national interest, I think, but I entertained it as a way of pushing the national interest, and I look back on it with a certain amount of regret. So I think we're not, and as I said a few moments ago, there is a Republican arm of the progressive movement. I mean, Wilsonianism is an American, is not just a Democratic position. It's an American position, for sure.
So,
and those of us who believe in a national interest approach, we're always fighting against the impulse, the American impulse to turn everyone into a democracy.
So, but now it's sort of morphed into something else, because if the Bush administration was looking at it from a systemic perspective and ignoring, I mean, the problem, I mean, there were many problems, but one of them is that they were pretending that open elections was synonymous with liberal democracy, when there's no I mean, there's very little connection between the two, and pretending that if you have fair elections, that the outcome is necessarily good. As you know, Bush gave that crazy statement in the White House where he said that, oh, the Hamas is going to be fine because it's going to have to deal with fixing potholes or something like that, the pothole theory of democracy. But that of course isn't true. Look at Hezbollah in Lebanon, look at Hamas in Gaza. But it morphed from that under the progressives into something else, which is that it's not that they aspire to democracy, because then they would like somebody like Orban, who's very popular in Hungary. It's that they want to push the progressive agenda, and if you're not willing to push it in your own internal thing, then you're not going to be their friend. You're not part of their group. They have a very specific political agenda, not democracy, not anything. It says progressive climate change, sexual ambiguity, push. It's a lot of things, but it's not saying we want to have an open and fair liberal
and
democracy.
they also want they also want your help. I mean, I'm saying you, Mr. or Mrs. Foreign Leader, they want your cooperation in helping them destroy their domestic enemy. So if you're Mohammed bin Salman and you got too close to Donald Trump and to Donald Trump's son-in-law, then you're going to pay a price when we come back into office. Same thing with Netanyahu. Same thing with Orban. Same thing with any of even Boris Johnson to a certain extent.
You're saying, can you just refine that point? You're saying that if a foreign leader works with a Republican president, then they're going to pay a price for it.
Yeah. I think that they have sent that signal really clearly. And the example they set, the biggest example of that is trying to turn Mohammed bin Salman into a pariah. Yes, they said it was over Khashoggi, but the real sin was Donald Trump. I mean, I think that's, to me that's obvious. I don't want to.
Oh, I agree with you, but
I don't have a smoking gun on that. But I wanted to say one more thing though. There's a point where it's very striking to me when I still have a few liberal friends around, despite I was a liberal not that long ago. Well, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I was an academic. All my friends were liberal before I became an apostate, and I still have some. And when I talk to them, it's very striking to me how alien what you and I are saying is to their way of thinking. If you're a mainstream liberal in the United States, not obsessed with politics and not seeking out alternative viewpoints and just reading the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and watching the mainstream media, then the kind of statements that you and I are making sound insane, and they sound crazy. And when you say that there's a kind of fanaticism on the part of the elite, they don't see it. Because they themselves are not fanatics by any stretch of the imagination, and they have been presented the agenda of the progressives as if it's kind of common sense and pragmatic, and not ideological. And one of the things that that Americans in general continue to believe in is that if we rope powers like China, like Iran, into mutual dependencies, then that will moderate them. This is what you called the pothole theory of democracy. Once Hamas has responsibility to its electorate, as if this is a reality of Palestinian politics, but the idea is once it has a responsibility for delivering jobs and good governance and so on, that's going to moderate it. And that is still working on the progressives, on the Biden administration with respect to Iran. That's the theory. That is the unstated theory behind the JCPOA. It's that if we work with Iran and we show Iran that it can achieve the things that it needs the most, which we assume it needs the most, which is the support of its own people and so on, then it will choose to work with us and to not oppose us on the things that we care about the most, like the nuclear question. And that's a completely false assumption, but that is in their thinking. There is, what I'm trying to say is that there's in addition to the ideologically blinkered approach, there is actually a pragmatism working there as well.
So, but the question then is, if that's the case, is there any way to persuade them that we're not insane? Because it's the truth is that our well-being rests on that question, doesn't it? I mean, it rests on the question of whether they're permeable to reason. Because if they think this is a pragmatic move, then maybe they are. I don't know.
We can stand the leadership, the top people, the top 10, 20 people in the Biden administration. They can live in both of these circles simultaneously. But what we can do is at key moments stand them before their own public and make them accountable. I think we successfully did that a couple of months ago when they were about to sign the Iran deal, and it became public that Iran has got open plots to kill Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, and Brian Hook. And the administration was going to go ahead and sign a deal with them and was going to go ahead and accede to their demand to remove the IRGC from the terror list when they were going to kill American officials. That embarrassed them. That truly embarrassed them. Now, they were not, when I say they can be in both circles at the same time, they were quite happy to remove Iran from the terror list. And they knew that these plots were active. What stopped them is that their own public became aware of this and said, "What are you doing? This makes no sense." And then they adjusted. There's a possibility there for things to work with.
Well, I mean, I guess that's heartening, except that it's not when you look at the media blackout on almost every piece of relevant information. And then this really does bring us back, I guess, to what happened in Gaza over the past weekend, because one of the pieces of information that really was repressed both by the government in Israel and also by the media is that very much like the Lebanese armed forces and Hezbollah in 2006, but although the roles were reversed, but in the case in Gaza, you had Hamas in the war rooms with Islamic Jihad the entire time. And they were providing logistical support for Islamic Jihad the entire time. And none of this could have happened if Hamas didn't green light everything that Islamic Jihad was doing. Moreover, when you talk about Iran, Islamic Jihad is an Iranian organization, was founded by Iran. And the Muslim Brotherhood is the parent organization for Hamas, which they state in their covenant. But Hamas receives enormous amount of support from Iran. Hamas leaders visit Iran regularly. They were there for Raisi's inauguration last April. They were there in May of last year. They're in constant communication with the Iranians. So they're partners. And yet, when you say we kept Hamas out of the operation, you're pretending that Hamas is not acting in partnership with Islamic Jihad when it is. And the media goes along with this. And so to try to show that this is incorrect when everybody's pretending that it's either not true or unimportant is very difficult. And therefore, it's very difficult to actually develop a strategic concept of what's happening for the public.
There's, all I know about Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad is what I read in the Israeli press, briefings from security officials. So I don't know. I don't know that. I don't disagree with your analysis, by the way, of Hamas being an ally of Iran. I do think there's a difference, though, and it's not completely insignificant, especially when looking at an operation like this. Hamas is an ally of Iran. Palestinian Islamic Jihad is a wholly owned subsidiary. It takes its orders from Tehran. Hamas is going to get suggestions from Tehran, maybe even some arm twisting, but it has the capability of making its own decisions separate from Tehran. I wouldn't want to get, from a point of strategically, I wouldn't want to get lost in this too much. You never know for sure when you're dealing with Iran and its proxies. If we look at PIJ, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, each one of them has its own relationship with Tehran, and each one of it has its own ability to maneuver. Nobody in the world has. There may be a couple of people in Israeli intelligence, I'm not sure. I doubt that even, though, who have a really clear view on how much independence Nasrallah has from Tehran. To what extent do they give him the big arrow or the little arrow, and so on. So I don't want to get too lost in it, but there is a difference clearly between PIJ and Hamas, and Hamas stayed out of the fight in terms of launching. Hamas decided it didn't want to get directly involved in the conflict with Israel, and I think the Israelis were not were probably wise in exploiting that difference. I wouldn't want to take it further and say that this is a great strategic victory, but tactically it was a wise thing to do. As far from what I know, I might come to change my mind.
No, I think that there wasn't a strategic, and I don't think that there was any strategic analysis done of what was happening at all, which is why the government, or the strategic analysis was, how do we fight an Iranian proxy while maintaining allegiance to the Biden administration? And this is what they came up with. I mean, I think like you were saying, the strategic questions that the government in Jerusalem is asking itself is not how we defeat our enemies, it's how do we keep our alliance with Washington. And then through this filter, all of these other things everything has to be seen through this filter. And under this filter, you can see why they never mentioned that the head of Islamic Jihad was in Tehran the entire time. And you can see why they made this distinction, which to my mind, I mean, like you said, the one or two officers in Israeli military. Go on.
Let me interrupt you here and ask you I'm not entirely following your reasoning, but I think I'm with you. I'm with you in the big points you're making, but I don't understand how making the distinction between PIJ and Hamas was part of the policy of not getting sideways with the Biden administration over Iran.
No, I think for two reasons. One is you don't want to have a wider conflict. I mean, you don't want to have a big war. But I'm sorry, I'm the woman who couldn't remember that it was Tuesday. So perhaps this early in the morning I'm having difficulty being clear, and I apologize both to you and of course to all of our viewers and listeners. But first and foremost, regarding Islamic Jihad, you don't want to talk about the fact that this is an Iranian attack against Israel when you are trying to maintain your partnership and be loyal to your boss in Washington, when you've subordinated your policy of confrontation vis-a-vis Iran to the American policy of appeasement towards Iran, then you can't actually confront Iran. And therefore, this government is not confronting Iran, whether it's vis-a-vis the Palestinians, whether it's vis-a-vis Lebanon, Hezbollah, or whether it's Iran's nuclear installations in Iran. That's one thing. You're not going to do any of those things because you can't have a confrontational position when you're subordinating your policy to a power that's appeasing the person, the entity that you're supposed to be confronting. That's one. Regarding Hamas and Islamic Jihad, I'm saying that Hamas is also, I mean, you may say it's an ally. Well, okay, then is it a proxy of Qatar, which is paying it? I mean, it is the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood is acting in alliance with Iran against the United States, against Israel, against Saudi Arabia, against Egypt, against the UAE. And that alliance between the Muslim Brotherhood and Iran is the reason that in 2014, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain stood with and Egypt stood with Israel against Hamas, which was being supported by Turkey and Qatar and the Obama administration. And it was because everybody recognized in 2014, and I think still today they understand, that the Muslim Brotherhood and Iran, for the purposes of their war against Israel, the Sunnis, America, are acting in alliance.
Okay. I don't, I have some minor disagreements with you there.
Let me hear them.
I don't know. I'm not sure how exciting it is to get into it, but I first of all,
give us one.
I'll give you one. I just say Hamas, not Muslim Brotherhood, because I don't know what the Muslim Brotherhood is. I get nervous when people start talking about the Muslim Brotherhood, because there's no such thing in the sense that there's a unified entity, the Muslim Brotherhood. You know, in Syria, how many different Muslim Brotherhoods are there? You know, in any Syrian city, Hama, how many Muslim brothers are there? It depends on the Muslim Brotherhood in which neighborhood you're talking about. So Hamas is its own thing, its own entity specific to the Palestinians. It has its interests in the Palestinian arena, and it's making decisions on the basis of that, and it's looking to the larger world to find allies that it can work with in order to get what it wants in the Palestinian arena. And obviously it has, you know, connections to other conflicts and so forth, but I prefer to just focus in on that because if we start talking about Muslim Brotherhood from an American foreign policy point of view, if we have to oppose the Muslim Brotherhood, it takes us into all kinds of rat holes in the Middle East that we don't need to go into. The key is weaken Iran. It's the conflict is with Iran, and Iran. That's the conflict.
All right. Well, I think the last thing that I want to talk about is something that you almost exclusively talk about, which is Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. And we have about 10 minutes to go on this show. So, you know, I follow your Twitter feed. I think all of you, if you want to, you have a tendency to combine really cool animal tricks with trench and strategic analysis of various arenas in the Middle East and other places. But you talk a lot about Armenia being an Iranian ally and about Azerbaijan being a much more open society than people would want to give it credit for or would think of Azerbaijan in such terms. Why and I'm trying to understand, why is this theater important and why should we care about it? So can you just, you know, spend the next 10 minutes or so explaining your view of Armenia and Azerbaijan and the whole conflict in Karabakh and all this?
Azerbaijan is my new favorite country. Well, it's not so new anymore. I went there for the war in 2020, and I fell in love with the place. But apart from just liking it, and I do like it, I think it's the most strategically important country that most Americans have never heard of. It's the only country in the world that borders both Russia and Iran. It goes back to what I was just saying a minute ago. What's the problem the United States confronts in the world today? The alignment or the alliance. I'd call it an alliance. You can call it an alignment between China, Russia, and Iran. That's the problem. And in the Middle East, it boils down to Iran. That's the Iran, Russia. But if we take care of Iran, all the other stuff gets a lot easier, because Russia and China are using Iran to make their inroads in the Middle East. Fully one third of all Iranians are Azerbaijanis. And Azerbaijan, the country, the Azerbaijani Iranian population is right underneath, just south of the country of Azerbaijan, across the Aras River. And young Azerbaijanis in Iran are increasingly becoming aware of their, Azerbaijan is a Turkic country. The Turkish that they speak in Turkey and Azerbaijani are mutually intelligible, more or less. And Azerbaijanis in Iran are increasingly aware of their Turkic and Azerbaijani identity. They're watching Turkish television, and they want some kind of connection with it. Now, historically, the Azerbaijani Turkish population in Iran has been tied into the Iranian elite. And so I'm not arguing that the Azerbaijanis of Iran are about to stand up and break away from Iran and create one country with Azerbaijan. But there's something going on there, very significant. It's the number one concern in Tehran. Number one national security concern. You can see, look at the difference between the way that the Tehran, the mullahs react, the Iranian leaders react when the United States, let's say Trump, tanked their economy, put them maximum pressure. You know, they shrugged. They said, "So what? We live on resistance and air. We don't need an economy." Then look at what's going on with Azerbaijan. Erdogan went to Baku after the victory of Azerbaijan over Armenia, and he read a poem, and there was a diplomatic crisis between Azerbaijan and Turkey. A couple of weeks ago,
between Azerbaijan and Turkey.
Between Iran and Turkey. The Iranians showed their weakness, what I'm trying to say. The Iranian elite is very sensitive to power presentation. So you don't complain, you don't whine, because that shows that you're weak. But they started whining and complaining because Erdogan read a poem, right? Mm-hmm. A couple of weeks ago, George Deek read a book. He read this book right here on Twitter, which is about Tabriz. Tabriz is the capital of Azerbaijani Iran. It's a completely Azerbaijani city in Iran. And George Deek, the Israeli ambassador, had a picture of himself reading the book, and he said, "I'm learning a lot about Tabriz, reading this Azerbaijani book," and that caused an incredible stir in Tehran. Right? They're so sensitive to this question; it's amazing. So I look at that and I say, if I'm the United States, I want to have good relations with Azerbaijan. Israel has understood this for years. Israel has very close relations with Azerbaijan. It's a military ally. It supported Azerbaijan in the war against Armenia, very quietly. I'm not sure how many Israelis are aware of how close these relations are. I don't know if Israelis know that they get a very significant amount of their oil and gas from Azerbaijan, which comes to them by way of Turkey, by the way. Now that's one thing, the Iran question. But Zbigniew Brzezinski called Azerbaijan, this is back around 1999, he called Azerbaijan the cork in the bottle of Central Asia. So Central Asia has all of these, Central Asia, I mean Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, to a lesser extent, Uzbekistan, they have very significant oil and gas reserves. And those can go to Europe without going through Russia, only by going through Azerbaijan. So there is this thing, the Southern Gas Corridor, which goes from Baku to Puglia in Italy, through Turkey, Greece, and Albania. And that we can see now, Putin has such influence over Europe because all of the European gas comes through Russia, or the lion's share of European gas comes from Russia. So if the United States was serious about countering China, Russia, and Iran, it should be looking to help Central Asian countries, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and others, to increase their autonomy in international relations. The only way to do that is through Azerbaijan. And on top of all these things, Azerbaijan is a lovely country. It's a very tolerant place. It has one of the largest Jewish communities in the Muslim world, continuously inhabited country by Jews for thousands of years. It gets maligned all the time because the Armenian diaspora has a lot of influence in France and in the United States, and it presents a completely false picture of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Armenia is a satellite of Russia, a satellite, not an ally. It's a satellite of Russia, and it's an ally of Iran. It tries to hide this because it wants to present Azerbaijan as the ally of Russia. It's totally false.
Well, we have this weird thing going on with Turkey, right? Over the past week or so. I mean, you have Vladimir Putin and Recep Erdogan went to Tehran. They met with Raisi, and then Erdogan traveled to Sochi and met with Putin. So on the one hand, he's carrying out these meetings with Iran and Russia, ostensibly to strengthen their ties and deal with Syria. And on the other hand, he humiliated Putin was it in Sochi or in Tehran, where he kept him waiting for a full minute in front of the cameras until Erdogan deigned to come into the room. In Sochi, he refused to eat dinner with him. He had coffee and cakes and left. He canceled a joint press conference. So on the one hand, he's having these meetings. He's going to Sochi. He's going to Tehran. He's meeting with them, which is the substance, right? But then out externally, the position that he's saying, I'm here, but I have contempt for them. And so I look at his actions, and I'm not quite clear. I know that you're much more supportive of Erdogan than I am, and so I wouldn't mind just having your take on it as somebody who comes at it from a much more sympathetic perspective vis-a-vis Turkey.
Look, let's start with Israel. I think that there's an easy. It should be very easy for Israelis to analyze Turkey because they're in an analogous situation. So you have to put aside for a moment all of the bilateral tensions between Israel and Turkey. Put those aside, and just look at it from a macro structural point of view. Barack Obama in 2013 to 2015 facilitated the rise in Syria of a Russian-Iranian alliance.
Right.
That gave, now Netanyahu started going every month or every other month. I don't know. I'm exaggerating, of course. I don't know how. I didn't count the number.
Tuesday and Friday, he got on a plane and met with Putin.
He was there. And now when he came to the United States and talked to Americans, he didn't advertise, and he wasn't interested in advertising how often he was in Moscow talking to Putin. And Israelis who are, notoriously incapable of keeping a secret kept those meetings with the subject of those meetings very secret. I mean, over time, we got a pretty good understanding. They developed a military to military deconfliction process and so on. But then look at what happened when the Ukraine war broke out. Israel didn't rush to support Ukraine against Russia. And what happened? Washington, which all of a sudden Washington decided that being anti-Russia is the flavor of the day, and the progressives came down on Israel really hard and said, "You're supporting Putin. What's wrong with you?" And in fact, they singled out Israel, much more than they singled out, for example, Germany. Which is the real weak position in the West is the German dependence on right. Russian gas, not the Israeli position in the UN, for example. But Israel came under a lot of pressure, and Israelis said, "Hey, look, guys, we live in a real world, and we've got this guy Putin on our doorstep to the north. What do you expect us to do? And this is the consequence of American foreign policy, which now Americans forget what they did. They're not even aware of what they did in 2013 to 2015, right? But when Putin went, the U.S. basically facilitated Russia in Syria, and it facilitated it by blocking Turkey all across the board. And it made an alliance. The United States made an alliance with Turkey's greatest enemy, which is the PKK. And the PKK, which the United States rebranded the PKK as the YPG, the YPG. The PKK rebranded itself as the YPG so as to pretend it wasn't the PKK. And then the United States rebranded the YPG as the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, democratic, like hell. It's the PKK in Syria, and the PKK historically is the ally of Russia and Iran. So the U.S. realignment toward Russia and Iran that took place under Obama has never been fully reversed, and nobody has suffered from it more than the Turks, who, just like the Israelis, have to go to Moscow to have some of their key interests adjudicated and respected. So, but if you look at what's going on between Russia and Turkey, it's a very complex picture, one of conflict and negotiation. The Turks are supplying Bayraktar drones to Ukraine, which is one of the most effective weapons that or a very effective weapon that the Ukrainians have against the Russians. They have a very serious defense relationship with Ukraine. The Azerbaijani military destroyed the Armenian military, which was completely backed and equipped by the Russians. It was a great humiliation to the Russians. The Turks have humiliated the Russians in Libya. They've humiliated them in Syria. They, as you know, with regard to Iran, the Turks rolled up a number of terror plots against Israel in Turkey recently. So these are, these guys meet, they smile, they kiss, they say sweet things to each other, but they're in very serious competition with each other. And the goal of U.S. foreign policy, if you think of U.S. foreign policy toward the Black Sea, Syria, the South Caucasus, this is an instrument. This should be the strategic goal should be to create a framework in which Israel and Turkey can achieve their security interests with the American umbrella. What we have done is we have created a frame in which we have forced the Israelis and the Turks to go to Moscow. That is the number one problem that we should be seeking to solve. And my disagreement with you, when I say you, Israelis and pro-Israelis, is not about Erdogan per se. It's about how do we create this framework that is going to pull Turkey back toward the United States and away from away from Russia.
I dare say that this is also the reason why you don't want to look at the Muslim Brotherhood as an edifice. And
no, I'm opposed. There's no such thing. I'm opposed to any intellectual construct that divides the Middle East up into a simple binary, and especially into a binary conflict, and especially one that focuses on ideology, whether it's extremists versus moderates, or Democrats versus autocrats.
Those concepts don't mean anything. Those concepts are invented in order to ignore ideology. They're not there in order to explain it or to actually think about it. It's there to prevent thought about these things. At any rate, we're going to have to
give me the last word, one sentence, because it's the key to everything. The fundamental building block of international relations everywhere, especially in the Middle East, is states. State interests. You got to understand each one of the main states And from the American point of view, there are three that matter more than any others. That's Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Israel. The U.S. wants a system in which those three can shelter comfortably under the American umbrella. They don't have to love each other. Part of our job is to run interference between you and the Turks, between you and the Saudis, and so on. And that picture has gotten totally jumbled. So when people start talking about ideology, it takes your focus away from where it should be, which is the American security framework helping its allies against its enemies.
All right, well, I'll buy that. And I think that, I can't give you the last word, Mike. This is my show. But
you should be a magnanimous and
yes, but I do just want to put what you said. I think that what you said is absolutely true. And when we look at what's happening with Turkey, I think I think it's very clear that you're right. I mean, we have to figure out a way, and we are. I mean, Israel and Turkey are coming together in a very profound way, and have been over the past year. And a lot of this is at Turkey's initiative, which is also extremely interesting. And I think that you're right. It goes back to an earlier thing that you were saying. I mean, there are two things that we were saying here that are extremely important from an American perspective and also from an Israeli and Middle Eastern perspective. One is that what's happening in the region is very much a function of the pathologies of American politics and the convulsions that the United States is going through, and that people in Israel have to understand this, and they have to understand that we have to be thinking locally about what's happening regionally. And if the United States is undermining our ability to advance our actual interests on the ground, then we have to figure out a way not to make those relations the most important thing that's guiding foreign policy. And that leads to the second thing, which is that the United States as allies, at the end of the day, may be the thing that also saves the United States. And so at this time, just as it was under the Obama administration, when we developed all the ties that became the Abraham Accords, so too now, we have to figure out how to work with the countries of our region that share our interests. And Turkey is one of the most prominent examples of a state that we have difficult relations with, but that fundamentally shares our interests. So I'm going to leave it at that. Is that okay?
Can I just fine tune that a little bit?
Yeah, Mike Doran, he's got to have the last word. You're a male chauvinist pig. Yeah.
No, I'm not. I'm a guest, and you're a Middle Easterner with hospitality. So
yeah.
The issue is Israel and Turkey are always going to have friction. I think there's going to be friction. The key thing is that every Middle Eastern country, it's true of all Middle Eastern countries, Israelis included, Turks included, all the Arabs, they want to beat their domestic enemies with America's stick. And they want to beat their regional enemies, the things that they fear, with America's stick, right? So the Israelis have a problem with the Turks. They start working with the Greeks and the Cypriots. And then all the friends of Israel start saying, well, the United States should move its base from Incirlik, Turkey, over to Greece, and Greece can handle all of take care of all the problems in the region from Greece. What a load of nonsense. What a load of nonsense. Look at the map, friends. Look at the map. And now, fortunately, Mark Twain said that God created war to teach Americans geography. The war in Ukraine has reawakened people to the strategic importance of Turkey, and it's also gotten people to focus a little bit and see that the relations between Turkey and Russia and Turkey and Iran are much more complex, nuanced, and conflictual than they were being presented as just a few months ago. And so that's all very good. But what the Israelis shouldn't do is go to Washington and say, your problem is Turkey, right? For how many years did the Israelis go and say, your problem is Turkey? That muddled the message. The problem is Iran. The problem is Iran. Turkey is a challenge that needs to be managed. It needs to be managed by the United States. The United States needs to do its job. in managing the Turkish-Israeli relations, and in not alienating the Turks. But years were spent of sending the wrong message and creating a fuzzy picture in everyone's mind. When I talk to a lot of Americans now about the Middle East, they don't understand who's a friend, who's an enemy, who's a difficult friend, and so on. So
Well,
what I'm trying to say is the Israelis
we have to end it.
Need to tell Americans to be good superpowers.
Right, but in the absence of a good American superpower, the Israelis have to be good Israelis and worry about our national interests. So as long as the United States hasn't, gotten its house in order, unfortunately,
Yeah. All right. Well, listen. Well, let's just end it. There is so much more to say.
There is so much more to
say. Carolyn,
we gotta have it.
You're this close to agreeing with me on Turkey. You're this close. It feels so good. It feels so good.
You're gonna ruin my reputation. We're not gonna talk about that anymore. But I think
no. I just wish more of your friends would be as intellectually honest as you are and just come say, yes, Mike.
No, it's more strategically desperate. We've reached that point where we're going to have to reach out to we're going to have to actually reach out to the Turks, unfortunately. Anyway, okay, I'll talk to you soon. Thank you so much for being on the program. Guys, thanks so much for watching the show this week and listening, and we will see you next week. Take care.